Aeolian resolved and unresolved. This is going to very closely parallel Ionian resolved and unresolved. In fact, it's exactly the same concept. In the Aeolian scale, we have the flat sixth interval, the C note that's unresolved. Now, interestingly, back in the G Ionian scale, it was the fourth interval that created the tension over the G major 7, but it's also the C note. So here's what that means. All of the chords in the key that we discovered were either resolved or unresolved to the G major 7, and that was 1, 3, and 6 are resolved, 2, 4, 5, and 7 are unresolved. And at this point, I'm hoping that that's something that you have memorized. All right, that's going to be the same in every key you ever play in, so it's some useful numbers out of the key to get together. So 1, 3, and 6 are resolved, 2, 4, 5, and 7 chords are unresolved to the G major 7 because they had that C note in it. Well, even when we look at the E minor 7 chord for E Aeolian, because it's the C note that makes it unresolved, even though it's a flat sixth interval, it's going to be the same chords in the key that are resolved and unresolved to the E minor. And again, that's why this is, these two degrees of the key are called relative major and minor. They function exactly the same way. So the 1, 3, and 6 chords are resolved to the 6th chord. The 2, 4, 5, and 7 chords are unresolved to the E minor 7 because they contain the C note. So the same thing happens. Now, before we actually get to the progressions, if I was to play a G major 7 with an E root, I'm simply going to be playing an E minor 9 chord. So that means every G major 7 that you know how to play up and down the neck, if you played it over an E root, you're going to get an E minor 9 chord. If I was to play a B minor 7 chord over an E root, I'm going to get an E minor 9 suspended chord. So both the 1 chord and the 3 chord are resolved to the 6 chord. Obviously, E minor 7 itself is resolved to itself. So now we have those same categories again. So we can create progressions, chord progressions, based on these resolved and unresolved chords. So the 2, 4, 5, and 7 chords will create movement in relation to the E minor 7 chord, and the 1, 3, and 6 chords create rest or resolution. Now, we're always, for purposes of clarity and to really get this into your ears sooner, we're going to do the same thing here where we're not going to use any resolved chord other than E minor 7 right now. Yes, you can use G major 7 and B minor 7 in place of those, but we're not going to do that now. So it's always going to be E minor 7 for the resolved. So what we're going to do is, again, set up a 4-bar progression using 2 bars of unresolved and 2 bars of resolved. What I chose in the book was A minor 7 for 2 bars and E minor 7 for 2 bars. And again, I'm going to give you some solo ideas to use over the progression. Other very, very common progressions that are unresolved and resolved related to Aeolian are playing C major 7, to E minor 7, that's very common. Another one is playing C major, a triad, D dominant triad. Again, yes, that's a D dominant triad. It doesn't have the flatted 7 in it. So 4 chord, 5 chord is a triad to the 6 chord. Very, very common, especially in rock tunes. Thousands of songs written with that, and it's exactly what we're doing right now in terms of harmony. It is, that was 2 bars of unresolved Aeolian to 2 bars resolved Aeolian, at least the way I set it up right there. Okay, so A minor 7 for 2 bars, E minor 7 for 2 bars. We're going to follow the same exact solo concepts that we did for the Ionian resolved and unresolved. And we're going to talk about the fact that when you have a progression that moves unresolved to resolved or vice versa, you have the choice of following the movement with your solo or not following the movement. And not following the movement is always going to be done by playing off of the resolved chord. And for our purposes here, we want to make things as simple as possible. So the simplest idea is to play the pentatonic scale of the resolved chord that you're playing. So E minor 7 is our resolved chord. The pentatonic scale is E blues. So E minor pentatonic. That's going to avoid the C note all the way through it, and it's going to have the same effect as it did when we used this idea in Ionian, resolved and unresolved. There will not be any movement heard in the solo, even though the chords are moving resolved to unresolved. So that's the first thing I'm going to demonstrate here. Just the fact that when you play E blues over the whole progression, you don't hear movement. So again, solo sounds like it's staying in the same place. That's the first idea I would get together, up and down the neck. Second idea is that we're going to play the C note. Again, this is the somewhat tedious little exercise here, but just make sure you do it. We're going to play just the C note and then resolve the C note. The C note has to be resolved down a half step to the B or up a whole step to the D. Now in this case, that's the flat 6 resolving either down to the 5th of E Aeolian or up to the flatted 7. So resolving down a half step to the 5th or up a whole step to the flatted 7. Okay, so tedious sounding exercise, but here is that so that we can begin to hear the movement. So I'm going to play nothing but a C for 2 bars, and then I'm going to resolve the C note. So we're hearing movement there. The next thing we're going to do, same thing we did with the Ionian, resolved and unresolved. We're going to add notes to the C note. And I might play a little bit more over the E minor 7 chord and play E blues or some such thing, but here it is with the C note and a couple of other notes added to it. Keep the notes relatively close to the C note. Don't be like play wide interval spaces. It just might sound a little odd at first. So keep the notes relatively close to the C note that you're going to add in there, but then make sure you resolve on the first beat. Okay? So that's adding to the C note. The next thing we're going to choose A blues as a more complete harmonic idea over the 2 bars of A minor, and then I'll play E blues, or I could play the whole E Aeolian scale, making sure I resolve that flat 6 if I play it. So here it is with A blues to E blues. Okay, and let's see, next idea. Make sure you get all these up and down the neck before you go on to the next one. Here's the next one. Playing more from the Dorian scale. So again, if I add more notes in, I do want to make sure I play the C so I can hear this movement. So I'm going to play more, using more of the 7 notes in the Dorian scale and more of the 7 notes in the Aeolian scale, and it's going to sound a little bit more melodic. Notes, more melodic. The final thing is looking at this entire thing from the E Aeolian scale, because in reality we are calling this an Aeolian progression for a reason. The whole thing revolves around this Aeolian scale. So another thing you can do is physically look at the Aeolian scale as you play through this whole thing. Again, similar to playing E blues through the whole thing where you don't hear the movement because that avoids the C note. But in this case, we're going to play the whole E Aeolian scale. And in the first 2 bars, I'm going to make sure I play that flatted 6. And then when we get to E minor 7, should I choose to play the flatted 6, I'm going to make sure that I resolve it. Okay, but it's going to be 2 bars of looking at mostly the E minor tone center, but adding that C note in, and then back to either E blues or E Aeolian. So here's that. Coming from an E tonality. So just another way to think about it. That's about it for Aeolian resolved and unresolved. See ya.